Hi, my name's Laura Cohen Ashman. I'm the writer-director of Sour Hall, an Audible smart horror. And this series is called What It Means to Be. And this episode is what it means to be using a femme gaze perspective.
Hi everyone, my name's Yomi Adegoke. I'm a journalist and co-author of a book called Slaying Your Lane. Aside from being able to, humanize women and, show emotions in a way that aren't detrimental or manic or dangerous, I think there are just several blind spots to the female experience that the feminine gaze helps color in and helps, make more realistic, I suppose. Again, it's quite complicated to explain, but I just think that in the same way that when I grew up sort of watching predominantly white television shows and, watching a Black experience filtered through that lens and thinking to myself, that doesn't make sense because a Black woman wouldn't go to bed without like a do-rag on or without a bonnet, and I'd be like, that doesn't make sense. It's the same thing when I'm watching shows that very clearly do not have any sort of lens of femininity to them, and watching female experiences, obviously you can't generalize a woman's experience by any means, but just seeing certain things and thinking, I don't know, even seeing certain traits and looking at a woman and sort of saying, seeing what the male gaze considers positive, considers strong, considers worthwhile in a woman versus what women see as valuable traits, which are often empathy, which are often open-mindedness, which are often quite different.
The original short story by Naomi Booth was very much, rooted in this sort of femme gaze perspective. And then when I was sort of like adapting it and expanding it out into a full series, I was really interested in this idea of like, okay, so what does a feminine gaze horror look like? And I think it kind of, at first I was like a bit nervous because horror is not like my wheelhouse. Like I'm not a horror nerd. I'm a massive baby. I'm like very bad at like
me and you both. So I went into it completely blind, but I thought what was really interesting, and maybe this is because of like my very specific identity and like the obvious kind of like crossovers between like myself and Ash's characters, but like it's so, I guess when you sort of mentioned Jordan Peele, it's fascinating to look at how one person's idyllic kind of getaway and like or life change or move can be another person's literal horror story and nightmare. Because I was like, listening, like even in the sort of like, with Ash's arrival and stuff and seeing her sort of again, without trying to like spoil things, like seeing her back and forth with certain characters, seeing like certain interactions that potentially like, because of her identity as like a Black queer woman, she may read one way and it's like, oh no, actually it's no, I'm not saying it in this way, I'm saying it in this other way, and that sort of like guardedness and fear, being in an area that's so white. And gosh, there's a part I remember where she talks about essentially the chemistry or the makeup of where they're being changing with like male presence, and I remember thinking this is one of the few times I've actually heard that reality vocalized, because that's a real thing where men can enter a space and the kind of atmosphere changes, and that's where they can be, you can feel it literally in the air, like the temperature just gets a little bit colder, or like the differences between, I guess the differences between George and Ash's experiences, both as queer women, but still, I mean, Ash being a Black woman, George not, still navigating these spaces differently, but then also both having to deal with like, the fear around their lesbian identities and what that meant for them. And I just think, and then comparing that to, the sort of male characters who aren't worrying about being Black, who aren't worrying about being gay, who aren't worrying about being women, and are able to move through those spaces in a completely different way. That's before you even sort of start getting to like the more supernatural, like, you know, the actual, you know, the actual more literal kind of fears. Often, you know, when we are looking at stories that are told from like a feminine, gaze or female perspective, we often get a more sort of nuanced and I suppose layered response in terms of like emotions. I think emotion is often depicted as a weakness, or is often depicted as something that as a hindrance to something, if that makes sense. After I cut my hair off, and I wrote this sort of like companion article like a few days after I did it, which was talking about the depiction I'd seen of women sort of shaving their heads in popular culture, and how it was off the back of like a you know, it was a signifier of rock bottom. It was a signifier of
like mental breakdown.
Exactly. And I feel that like it's very frequent that we see sort of these depictions of, you know, women and emotion, and it being sort of over the top, or it being like a signifier of like weakness, or they're about
hysterical,
exactly, hysterical, like on the precipice of some sort of like breakdown, or something like that.
It's, you know, I think especially in kind of very American Hollywood, big studio, like especially like sort of superhero films, you know, again, it's this very like the lone male hero is like on the journey, and only it's very individualistic. It's very like, you have to be strong, you can't let your emotions get in the way. But then it's also like when you have, as we've started to have more female superheroes, it's still very much filtered through this like male gaze, where it's like all of the qualities that make her good and strong are just what we view as masculine qualities. So it's like, instead of being like, okay, but what is, you know, what are deemed to be feminine qualities that can be highlighted as positive traits, and the sort of the strength in vulnerability, the strength in empathy, the strength in emotion and compassion and nurturing and selflessness. Thanks for tuning in to this conversation with Yomi, and make sure to check out the rest of the videos and episodes of Sour Hall.